I knew from the moment I stepped into this house that love had no place here. The wedding was a quiet, formal affair. No vows whispered in tenderness, no stolen glances filled with promise. Just a contract signed, a ring slipped onto my finger, and a husband who refused to acknowledge me. Damien Whitmore had been silent from the beginning. Not in the way of a quiet man but in the way of a ghost. He never spoke to me, never looked at me for longer than a few seconds. At first I thought he was just reserved, struggling to adjust to this forced marriage as much as I was. But then I realized he wasn't struggling at all. He simply didn't care. Every morning I woke up alone. The other side of the bed was always untouched, as if he had never even considered sharing it with me. At breakfast I would set his plate across from mine, waiting, hoping that maybe today he would say something, anything. But he never did. He would take his food, eat in complete silence, and leave without a glance in my direction. I tried to be patient. I told myself that marriage took time, that maybe he just needed to feel safe enough to let me in. So I tried. I wrote little notes, slipping them onto his desk. They were never acknowledged. I cooked his favorite dishes, the ones his housekeeper told me he liked. He ate them without reaction, as if they were no different from any other meal. I even attempted to learn sign language, convinced that if I could speak his supposed language maybe he would finally talk to me. But there was no response. No appreciation. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. It filled every corner of the house, pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. The maids and butlers spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to break whatever unspoken rule Damien had set. Even the air felt heavy, thick with the weight of words left unsaid. One evening as I stood by the large window overlooking the garden, I caught sight of him outside. He was sitting on the stone bench, the moonlight casting shadows across his sharp features. His expression was unreadable, his gaze fixed on the sky. For a moment something inside me softened. Maybe he wasn't heartless. Maybe he was just lost, just as unsure about this marriage as I was. I hesitated before stepping outside, my bare feet sinking into the cool grass. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of roses from the garden. I stopped a few feet away from him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Damien," I whispered. No response. I took another step closer, gathering the courage I had left. Slowly I reached out, my fingers brushing against his hand. His skin was warm against mine, and for a fleeting second I thought he might turn to me, that he might say something. Instead he pulled away. Not violently, not with anger, just a quiet, deliberate withdrawal. He stood up without a word and walked back into the house, leaving me alone in the cold. I stared at my empty hand, my chest tightening with an ache I couldn't name. That was the moment I realized. I wasn't just married to a silent man. I was married to a man who had no intention of ever letting me in. I refused to give up. I told myself that marriage wasn't meant to be easy, especially not one like ours. Damien and I were strangers forced into a lifetime commitment. Maybe he just needed time. Maybe he needed proof that I wasn't here to hurt him, that I wasn't like the people who had let him down before. So I tried. I started with the smallest gestures. I brewed his coffee exactly the way his housekeeper said he liked it. Black, no sugar, extra hot. Every morning I placed it on his desk in the study, hoping he would acknowledge it, maybe even say thank you. But each time I checked later, the cup was always empty, not a single word left behind. Then I began leaving notes. Short ones at first. "I hope your day goes well. Don't forget to eat. There's rain in the forecast. Take an umbrella." I placed them on his bedside table, inside his books, anywhere he might notice. He never wrote back. He never even moved them. They just sat there, untouched, gathering dust like forgotten remnants of my efforts. I refused to let the silence win. If he couldn't speak, I would find another way. One evening I sat in the library, a book of sign language spread out before me. If he wouldn't use words, maybe I could speak to him in a way he understood. I traced the letters of the alphabet with my fingers, slowly memorizing the shapes, the movements. It felt like progress. It felt like hope. That night when he returned from work, I waited for him in the dining room. He barely glanced at me before sitting down, his usual routine. But this time, instead of speaking, I lifted my hands and slowly signed, "Good evening." His fork stilled against his plate. For the first time in weeks he actually looked at me. His blue eyes locked onto mine, something unreadable flashing in them. My heart pounded, a rush of nervousness and excitement bubbling up. Had I finally gotten through to him? Was this it? But then just as quickly as the moment appeared, it was gone. His gaze flickered away and he resumed eating, completely dismissing me. I clenched my hands in my lap, my fingers trembling. That night, I curled up in bed and stared at the ceiling, my chest aching. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, he never responded. He never acknowledged me. I wasn't his wife. I was nothing more than a shadow in his life, a presence he refused to see. And yet, despite the pain, despite the rejection, I still wasn't ready to give up on him. Not yet. Nights were the hardest. During the day I could distract myself. I could fill the silence with movement. Cooking, reading, wandering through the empty halls of this house that never felt like home. But when darkness fell and the world grew quiet, there was nothing to drown out the loneliness. Nothing to stop the ache in my chest from settling deep into my bones. One particular night, sleep refused to come. The emptiness beside me in bed felt heavier than usual, pressing against my skin like a reminder of everything I lacked. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant tick of the grandfather clock down the hall. And then I saw it. A faint glow of light coming from the garden. Curious, I slipped out of bed and padded barefoot across the cold floor. Peeking through the curtains, I spotted him. Damien. Sitting on the stone bench in the middle of the garden, his figure bathed in silver moonlight. It wasn't the first time I had seen him there, but something about this moment felt different. He wasn't working, wasn't reading, wasn't distracted by anything. He just sat there still and quiet, staring up at the night sky. My chest tightened. I didn't know what possessed me to move, but before I could think better of it, I was already walking outside. The grass was cool beneath my feet, the scent of roses filling the air. The closer I got, the more I could see the details of his face. His sharp jawline, the slight furrow in his brow, the way his lips were parted just enough as if he wanted to say something but never would. I hesitated a few steps away. Damien. He didn't turn. He didn't flinch. It was as if my voice never even touched him. I swallowed, my throat tight, and stepped closer. My hand trembled slightly as I reached out, hesitating before my fingers brushed against his. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cool night air. For the briefest second he didn't move. My breath caught. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Had I finally reached him? Had I finally cracked through the ice that surrounded him? But then, slowly, deliberately, he pulled his hand away. He stood, his broad shoulders tense, and without so much as a glance in my direction, he walked back toward the house, leaving me behind. The night air suddenly felt colder. I looked down at my empty hand, my fingers still tingling from the brief contact. My chest ached, a deep, hollow kind of pain that I didn't know how to fix. I had tried everything. Everything. And yet, no matter what I did, he still refused to let me in. But the worst part? I still wasn't ready to let go. I don't know what I expected when I touched him that night. Maybe I thought he would finally look at me, finally say something, finally let me in. But all I got was more silence. More distance. And an emptiness inside me that grew wider with every passing day. I told myself I would stop trying. That I would stop reaching for a man who didn't want to be reached. But the problem with love, real, foolish, desperate love, is that it doesn't just turn off because you tell it to. So I kept waiting. Kept hoping. Until the night that changed everything. I had been searching for something, my book maybe, or a misplaced scarf. I wandered through the house, aimlessly opening doors, looking for something to focus on other than the ache in my chest. That was when I heard it. A voice. Deep, smooth, unmistakable. I froze outside his study, my breath catching in my throat. For a second I thought I was imagining it. That I had gone insane from all the silence, that my mind was playing cruel tricks on me. But then I heard it again. Clearer this time. Damien. Speaking. I pressed myself against the door, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I told you I don't care, he was saying, his voice cold, clipped. It's done. It doesn't matter anymore. Pause. Said. No, she won't leave. She still thinks this marriage is real. A sharp, suffocating pain spread through my chest. I didn't realize I had been holding my breath until it left me in a shaky exhale. My hands trembled, my nails digging into the wooden frame of the door. He could speak. All this time he could speak. The realization hit me so hard I thought my legs might give out. The silence, the avoidance, the distance, it hadn't been because he was mute. It hadn't been because of some deep emotional wound I needed to heal. It had been a choice. I stumbled back, the world spinning around me. My stomach twisted, nausea rising in my throat. How many nights had I laid awake, feeling guilty, wondering if I wasn't enough? How many times had I tried, reaching for him again and again, breaking my own heart in the process? And all this time he had been perfectly fine. Living in his silence. Watching me suffer. I wanted to burst through that door. To scream. To demand an explanation. But what would that change? He had already made it clear. I was nothing to him. My hands curled into fists at my sides. Fine. If that's how he wanted it, then I would give him exactly what he wanted. No more trying. No more reaching. From this moment on, I would stop chasing a man who had no intention of ever turning around. Something inside me shut off that night. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even confront him. The pain was there, raw and suffocating, but it no longer controlled me. Instead, it settled deep in my chest, turning cold, turning numb. The next morning, I woke up before him just as I always did. I went downstairs just as I always did. But this time I didn't set the table for two. I didn't pour his coffee, didn't cook his breakfast, didn't wait for him to sit across from me in silence. I ate alone. When he finally came downstairs, he barely spared me a glance before heading to the kitchen. I didn't watch him like I used to. I didn't wait for him to acknowledge me. I simply finished my meal, stood up and walked away. He didn't say a word. By the afternoon, I had moved all of my belongings to a separate bedroom. The bed was smaller, the space unfamiliar, but it felt lighter somehow, like I could finally breathe. I spent the rest of the day in there, not waiting for him to notice, not hoping for him to care. I stopped leaving him notes. I stopped preparing his favorite meals. I stopped looking at him when we passed each other in the halls. And for the first time since this marriage began, I didn't wait for him to love me. At first, nothing changed. He acted the same, cold, distant, indifferent. But I could feel the shift. The silence that had once crushed me now hung between us like an invisible barrier, one that I had built this time. A week passed. Then another. One night I sat in the library, curled up in a chair with a book in my hands. I wasn't really reading, just staring at the words, letting my mind drift. That was when I heard the faintest creak of the door. I didn't look up, but I could feel him, standing there, watching me. It lasted only a second before he walked away. A few days later, I found an extra cup of tea on the table beside me while I worked. Not a word. No explanation. Just there. I didn't touch it. I wasn't sure when it started happening, but I began catching him watching me more often. His eyes lingered longer than before. When I walked past him, I could feel his presence trailing behind me, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. But I wasn't going to be the one to break the silence this time. If he wanted something from me, he would have to be the one to reach for it. And if he never did, then I would learn how to let him go. The silence between us changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight I had once struggled under. It was different now, something cautious, something uncertain. I no longer waited for him at breakfast. I no longer tried to fill the empty spaces he left behind. And maybe that was why, for the first time, he started to notice. It was in the small things at first. The way his eyes would flicker toward me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his steps would slow whenever we passed each other in the halls. I could feel him hovering as if he wanted to say something but never did. One evening as I sat in the library, the air thick with the scent of old paper and ink, I felt it again, that presence, that quiet weight of his gaze on me. He lingered in the doorway longer than usual, but I didn't acknowledge him. I turned a page in my book, my fingers steady, my expression calm. After a moment he left without a word. I told myself it didn't matter. But then the little things started changing. One night as I walked into the dining room, I noticed an extra plate of food waiting at the table. My usual dish, perfectly arranged. I paused, staring at it for a long time before slowly sitting down. He wasn't there, but I knew. The next morning I found an umbrella resting by the front door, positioned carefully next to my shoes. It wasn't raining yet, but the sky was gray, heavy with unspoken promises of a storm. I hesitated before reaching for it, my fingers grazing the handle. It was warm, as if someone had only just placed it there. That night I woke up coughing, my throat raw, my skin burning with fever. I barely had the strength to move, my body aching with exhaustion. When I finally forced myself out of bed, I found something on my nightstand. A glass of water. A small bottle of medicine. And a folded blanket neatly draped over the chair. I stared at it, my vision hazy, my heart unsteady. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to pretend it didn't mean anything. But as I climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket around my shoulders, I felt the smallest crack in my carefully built walls. I wasn't sure what Damien was doing. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out. The medicine, the food, the small gestures, I should have ignored them. I should have told myself they meant nothing. But they stayed with me, lingering in the quiet moments when I was alone, filling my mind with questions I didn't want to ask. Why no? Why was he suddenly paying attention? I told myself it didn't matter, but the thought followed me everywhere. One afternoon as I wandered the house, I found myself in the study. Damien's sanctuary. I had avoided this room since the night I overheard him speaking, since the truth had shattered everything I believed. But now, standing in the doorway, I couldn't look away. The room smelled of aged paper and cedarwood. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that looked untouched, their spines pristine. His desk was immaculate, everything arranged with the kind of precision that spoke of a man who needed control. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe I just wanted proof. Something tangible to remind myself why I had stopped caring. Then I saw it. A small leather-bound notebook resting at the edge of the desk. Unlike everything else in the room, it looked worn, its pages slightly frayed as if it had been opened and closed too many times. I knew I shouldn't. I knew this was crossing a line. But my fingers moved before I could stop myself. The first few pages were filled with numbers, figures, notes about business. But then halfway through the handwriting changed. The letters became slanted, rushed, filled with emotion. I should have known better. Love is nothing more than a cruel illusion. She promised forever and then she left like it was nothing. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat. A name appeared over and over again, written with an intensity that made my chest tighten. Victoria Langley. I had never heard of her before, but I didn't need to. I knew what this was. Who she was. She was the reason he shut himself away. The reason he pretended to be mute. The reason he refused to let me in. A betrayal buried in ink, in words he had never spoken aloud. I pressed my fingers against the page, feeling the faint imprint of his handwriting beneath my touch. I had spent so long wondering what I had done wrong. Why I wasn't enough. But it had never been about me, had it? Damien hadn't been punishing me. He had been punishing himself. I closed the notebook slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. For the first time I saw him not as the cold, distant man who ignored me, but as someone who had been abandoned before. Someone who had loved and lost. Someone who was still breaking, piece by piece. And the worst part? I didn't know if I hated him for it, or if I understood him too much. I told myself that knowing the truth didn't change anything. Damien's past belonged to him just as mine belonged to me. His heartbreak wasn't my responsibility to fix, and his silence wasn't something I would chase anymore. I had made my choice, to stop reaching for a man who never reached back. And yet something was different. The shift was subtle at first. He still didn't speak, still kept his distance. But his presence felt different now. Less like a shadow I couldn't touch and more like something cautious, something uncertain. I noticed it in the mornings. Before, he would always eat in silence, never acknowledging my presence. But now, when I walked into the dining room, I would catch him pausing for just a second, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup as if he wanted to say something. He never did. But the hesitation was there, lingering in the quiet moments between us. I ignored it. I pretended not to notice. Then one evening the heater in my bedroom broke. The cold was unbearable, seeping into my bones no matter how many blankets I piled on. I shivered as I wrapped my arms around myself, cursing the faulty system in this giant, lifeless house. By morning it was fixed. I hadn't called anyone. I hadn't asked for help. But when I woke up, the air was warm again, the familiar hum of the heater filling the space around me. I stared at the vent, then at the closed door of my room, my pulse unsteady. It wasn't a coincidence. I tried to brush it off, but then more things started happening. Small things. Things I couldn't ignore. When I walked into the library one afternoon, I found my favorite book sitting on the armchair where I always read, a silk bookmark carefully placed inside. When I reached for my coat before heading outside, I found a scarf, his scarf, draped over it as if someone had silently anticipated the cold before I did. When I worked late into the night, I noticed a cup of tea appearing on my desk. No words. No notes. Just there. Each time I told myself not to overthink it. That these gestures meant nothing. That I had spent months suffering under his silence, and a few unspoken kindnesses wouldn't erase that. But the hardest thing to ignore was the way he looked at me now. Before, Damien's gaze had always been cold, distant, like I was just another object in his carefully controlled life. But now it lingered. When he thought I wasn't paying attention, when I was lost in thought, when I was looking anywhere but at him, I could feel it. Like he was trying to understand me. Like he was trying to find the words he had denied me for so long. One night I finally broke. I was coming down the staircase when I saw him standing in the foyer, his back turned, his fingers resting against the edge of a small table near the door. The same table where I had once left my wedding ring after he had ignored me for weeks. I had put it back on eventually, not because I believed in this marriage, but because I had been too exhausted to fight for anything else. Now, in the dim glow of the chandelier, I saw him staring at it. His fingers hovered above the smooth gold band, his expression unreadable. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders stiff, as if he was battling something inside himself. I should have walked away. But I didn't. Why are you doing this? My voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence between us. He stilled. A long moment passed before he turned, his eyes locking onto mine. Deep blue. Darker than I had ever seen them. He didn't answer. He didn't sign anything. But for the first time since I had married him, I saw something raw, something unguarded in his gaze. Regret. Or maybe something more. I didn't know what to do with that. So I did the only thing I could. I turned and walked away. And this time, for the first time, I felt him watching me leave. I had spent months feeling invisible. I had begged for his attention, his affection, anything that could make this marriage feel real. And now, when I had finally stopped trying, when I had convinced myself that I no longer cared, he started to linger. He started to watch me, to leave quiet gestures in my path, to act as if I was suddenly worth noticing. But it was too late. I had already made my decision. I was leaving. The thought had come to me quietly at first, like a whisper in the back of my mind, growing louder with each passing day. There was nothing left for me here. No love, no future, nothing that could make up for the months of silence and suffering I had endured. I packed my bags without hesitation, my movements steady, my heart strangely calm. I didn't need much. Just a suitcase, a few essentials. Enough to walk out of this house and never look back. By the time I zipped the last bag shut, my hands were trembling. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the unfamiliar room that had become my sanctuary. The place where I had hidden myself away from him. It didn't feel like home. It never had. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the door. And then I heard it. A voice. Low, rough, unsteady. Don't go. I froze. For a moment I thought I had imagined it. That my exhaustion, my emotions had conjured something that wasn't real. But then I turned. And there he was. Damien stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, but his eyes were filled with something I had never seen before. Panic. Fear. Desperation. My breath caught in my throat. The man who had spent months pretending to be mute had just spoken. And I had no idea what to do. Silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his chest rising and falling unevenly. He looked like he wanted to move, like he wanted to reach for me, but he didn't. You don't get to do this, I whispered, my voice shaking. You don't get to ignore me for months and then talk when I finally decide to leave. He flinched. The tiniest reaction, but I saw it. I wanted to hurt him. I wanted to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he had put me through. But the worst part? He already did. It was written all over his face. His voice cracked as if the words had been locked inside him for so long that they had forgotten how to form. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his blue eyes dark with something raw, something real. Please. I had dreamed of this moment. Dreamed of him finally speaking to me, of him finally choosing me. But now that it was happening, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss. Because no matter how much I had wanted this before, I wasn't sure if I wanted it anymore. I inhaled sharply, forcing the tears back, gripping the handle of my suitcase so tightly my knuckles ached. I needed you, I said softly, my voice breaking. And you weren't there. Then I stepped past him. And this time I was the one who left him behind. I didn't make it past the front door. My hand was on the handle, my heart hammering in my chest when I felt it, his presence behind me closer than before. The air between us was thick, charged with something I couldn't name. But I refused to turn around. Not this time. Elena. His voice, rough, strained, sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded foreign, like it had been locked away for too long, like even he wasn't used to hearing it. I swallowed hard, gripping the suitcase tighter. Don't. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want him to stop me. I had spent months waiting for this moment, months hoping he would break his silence, that he would reach for me before it was too late. But it was too late. I lied, he said suddenly, his words tumbling out in a rush. I lied to you, I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve to ask for anything now, but please, just listen. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath unsteady. I was afraid. His voice cracked. I thought if I stayed silent, if I shut you out, I could keep myself from feeling anything for you. That if I never spoke, I would never get attached. He exhaled sharply, his breath uneven. But I was wrong. Because I lost you anyway. I turned then, slowly, reluctantly. And what I saw nearly shattered me. Damien Whitmore, the man who had spent months pretending I didn't exist, stood before me with pain etched into every line of his face. His blue eyes, always so cold, now burned with something raw, something desperate. His shoulders were tense, his hands curled at his sides as if he was barely holding himself together. I never wanted to marry you. His voice was hoarse, honest, and it stung like an open wound. I never wanted a wife, never wanted to care for someone again. I thought if I pushed you away you would eventually stop trying. That I would be safe from whatever this is. He let out a shaky breath. But I was never safe from you, Elena. You got to me anyway. My chest tightened painfully. You let me suffer, I whispered. You watched me suffer. He flinched, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. I know. The silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that his words meant something, that they could erase the months of loneliness and pain. But words were easy. And I had spent too long believing in something that wasn't real. I forced my voice to stay steady. You don't get to say this now. Not when I've finally decided to walk away. His jaw tightened. I know I don't deserve a second chance. He took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't let you go without trying. Tears burned the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Then prove it, I said, my voice breaking. Not with words. Not with apologies. Prove it. I didn't wait for his response. This time I walked out the door. And he didn't stop me. I thought leaving would be easy. I thought walking away from Damien Whitmore, from this cold and empty marriage, would feel like freedom. But it didn't. The silence I had once hated followed me, but this time it wasn't his. It was mine. Days passed, then weeks, and I told myself I was fine. I told myself I had done the right thing. I rented a small apartment on the other side of the city, away from the suffocating walls of his mansion, away from the shadows of the life I had tried to build with him. I kept busy. I worked. I read. I went outside just to remind myself I was capable of existing without him. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop waiting. Waiting for him to find me. Waiting for him to prove it. And yet he never came. I told myself that was what I wanted. That it was better this way. Until one night when a knock at my door shattered everything I thought I knew. I hesitated before opening it, my pulse unsteady. But when I did, I wasn't met with Damien. I was met with his driver. Miss Carter, the older man said gently, his voice careful as if he knew he was about to break me. Mr. Whitmore asked me to bring you this. He handed me a small, neatly wrapped package. No words. No letter. Just an object given in silence. I stood there, frozen, until he nodded politely and walked away. My hands trembled as I closed the door behind me. I shouldn't have opened it. I should have thrown it away. But I didn't. I peeled back the paper, my breath hitching the moment I saw what was inside. It was a notebook. The same notebook I had found in his study. The one filled with the pain of his past. The one that had given me answers I never wanted to know. But this time there were new pages. My fingers shook as I flipped through them, my chest tightening with each word written in his familiar, sharp handwriting. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to come back. But I need you to know I was never silent because I hated you. I was silent because I was afraid. I swallowed hard, my throat burning as I kept reading. You were the first person to make me want to break my own rules. You were the first person I was afraid to lose. And I lost you anyway. Tears blurred the ink before I could stop them. I closed the notebook, pressing it tightly to my chest as if I could somehow hold on to the parts of him he had never given me before. He wasn't asking for me to come back. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was simply showing me his truth. For the first time, Damien Whitmore wasn't hiding. And I didn't know what to do with that. I told myself I wouldn't go back. That I had done my part, that I had given everything I had to a man who never met me halfway. I told myself his words, his regrets didn't change the past. That I had already spent too many nights waiting for him to see me, and I wouldn't be that woman again. But the truth was I had never stopped waiting. I didn't go to him right away. I let the days pass, let the weight of his words settle deep in my chest, let myself feel everything I had pushed away for so long. And then one evening when the sun had just begun to set, I found myself standing in front of his house. Our house. The door was unlocked. The staff was nowhere in sight. The house felt different, quieter but not in the way it used to be. I stepped inside, my heart hammering, my hands clenched at my sides. Every inch of me screamed to turn back, to leave before I made a mistake I couldn't undo. Then I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the living room as if he had been waiting for me. His hair was slightly disheveled, his shirt wrinkled like he hadn't been sleeping well. But his eyes, those deep blue eyes, held something I had never seen before. Relief. He took a step forward, hesitated. Elena. For the first time, my name on his lips didn't feel like an afterthought. It felt like a plea. A promise. I had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in my head. I had thought of all the things I would say, the accusations I would throw at him, the pain I would demand he acknowledge. But when I finally spoke, my voice was quiet. Why didn't you come find me? He exhaled slowly, his fingers curling at his sides. Because I wanted you to choose for yourself. His gaze searched mine, unsteady but certain. I didn't want to chase you if you didn't want to be caught. I had spent so long running after him, chasing a man who had refused to turn around. But now for the first time he was standing still, waiting for me. My chest ached. I don't know how to forgive you. I know, he whispered. I swallowed hard. And I don't know if we, can ever work. He took another step closer, slowly, as if afraid I would disappear. Then let me prove it. His voice was raw, quiet. Not with words. Not with apologies. But with time. I stared at him, at the man who had once been a stranger in my own home. At the man who had once locked himself away in silence, too afraid to feel. But there was no silence between us now. There was only a choice. My choice. I inhaled shakily, feeling the weight of everything we had been, everything we had lost, everything we could be. And then slowly I reached out, just enough for my fingers to brush against his. This time he didn't pull away. This time he held on. And for the first time in a long, long while I let myself believe.